light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved, ever be. Welcome. I am Sister Who. Today I just wanted to offer a few thoughts and reflections on the contrast, the comparison, I guess, between power and presence. I sometimes hear people talk about having power, or motivational speakers who will talk about claiming your power, or standing in your power, or how to increase your power, or my neo-pagan friends, how to have more power in your spells, or Christian friends, how to put more power in your prayers. And I've never been totally comfortable with those discussions, because it always seems, even in those sorts of presumably safe or spiritually recommendable contexts, that the quote still holds true: power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. The only exception to that I've ever found is the power of love. And if you have the power of love, I find that it balances and stabilizes all the other powers, so that they don't become corrosive, so that beauty and harmony and everything good comes out of it. If you first start with the power of love, rather before seeking any other power, because as soon as the power of love is absent, every other power that is in anywhere around becomes abusive and basically runs amok, and does more harm than good. If you have the power of love, then the power of being an administrator, for example, will move you to think of what is best and what is most enjoyable, what is most desired, by all of those under your authority, all those for whom you provide administration, all the people who work for you or with you. If you have the power of love, you can do so as a servant rather than as a tyrant. In the biblical story of the Last Supper, Jesus made the comment to his followers, whoever wants to be greatest must be the servant of all. If we approach spiritual service or spiritual leadership of any kind as being spiritual service, that it's not about the power of the position, but it's about the service and the contribution that the person in that position can provide, it keeps things in balance, it keeps things healthy, it keeps things oriented around love and wisdom. As soon as the power becomes its own objective, as soon as it's about having the power to do or say or whatever, having power so that no one will be able to question me, having power so that I can do whatever I want. Without love, those sorts of pursuits immediately slip into all sorts of abuse and negative forms. In essence, if you have power without love, you wind up doing damage to relationships. Because in order to be healthy, relationships depend upon there being love. To refocus a little bit, though, when we say the other corollary to power that I mentioned was presence. So the question then becomes, if I'm not pursuing power, what does presence mean? And that's where, instead of, quote, pursuing your power or finding your power, I would encourage people to contemplate how they can be fully present. And when I say fully present, I mean looking in the mirror and knowing yourself well enough to know what you can contribute to a situation, and to know that at some points what may be most necessary is simply to contribute your presence to the situation. By having a person in a situation who is setting a better example, a person who is being peaceful and quiet and mutually respectful, a person who is listening instead of dictating to others, a person who is considering and even voicing for the whole group, how does this affect George or Susan, or how does this affect that group of people or those people? And by throwing that question into the conversation, without even saying what the group should do, they may be helpful, if other people respond, to steering the group in a more positive direction, so that what they seek is to be fully present with wisdom and with love. What they wind up doing is having a power of persuasion. But if they seek the power of persuasion without paying attention to the presence that they have there, essentially you wind up a little more than a bully, someone who's trying to find a way to dominate the conversation or control the meeting instead of serving the meeting. If a particular meeting is to decide what is the best answer for an aspect of neighborhood development, or if it's a family trying to decide whether to take a vacation in this way or that way, or whether to plant this or that in the family garden, or how to divide up the household tasks and chores. If it is done in a way that is focusing on love and wisdom and serving the needs of each other and the needs of the family, power will be assigned to each different person for each different task. You're the one who needs to wash the windows. Here's a roll of paper towels and a bottle of glass cleaner. By being given those resources, that person now has power. By being assigned the task, the person now has power, because they will be the one who ultimately determines how it's done. If it's done well, if it's done in a sloppy manner, if it's done with attentiveness, if it's done with carelessness. Power follows involvement in life. It doesn't have to be pursued. If, coming back to that point of service though, if it's about serving the moment, which on that note I would say you cannot effectively serve any moment unless you are being fully present. If your thoughts or your attention is somewhere else, even while you're here, you're not going to be doing a good job where you are. If somebody, has just been in, they've just experienced a misfortune of some kind, and they're very sad, maybe they have minor injuries. If your thoughts are 1,000 miles away on what you were planning to do in the office that day, or thinking about some event you're going to be doing tomorrow, or some relative with whom you had an argument over the telephone, you're not fully present, and you won't do your best with that person who is looking to you for compassion and assistance. In a similar sort of way, if it is your own need that is coming up front and center and making itself clear and obvious to you, that you recognize, for example, you are hungry. And if you are not fully present in that moment to where you are ignoring your own needs, you may get to later in the afternoon and suddenly run out of energy, and stop for a moment and realize that you are hungry and that you haven't been tending to your own needs properly. I once knew of a young man who was working as a camp counselor in a Midwestern state during the summertime, and the temperatures were quite extreme. And, because this was for a whole week, he'd been out in the sun. He didn't happen to like fresh fruit very much, so he wasn't eating the banana and the orange they were giving him at lunch every day. The problem with that is that in very short order, because he didn't know about nutrition, he was depleting all the B vitamins in his system and nutritionally imbalancing himself, and wound up with some serious health concerns. Another person, many people who have visited Colorado during the summertime, if they're not familiar with how dry the climate is here and they don't make an effort to drink lots of water while they're in Colorado, A lot of people wind up at local hospitals in the emergency room suffering from the effects of dehydration. They're present here, but they're not fully present if they're forgetting that they're in Colorado and what it means to be in Colorado in terms of the climate and the effect of the climate upon them. They may be seeking the power of persuasion in a business meeting, or the power of running a marathon, or helping to build something, or visiting Red Rocks Amphitheater, which is a fantastically beautiful and significantly historical place to visit. But I have friends who have come from lower elevations because the city of Denver is at 5,000 feet of elevation, and the amphitheater Red Rocks is higher yet than that. And a particular friend who simply walked the incline from the back row of the amphitheater to the parking lot and almost passed out because he had totally forgotten about the difference in altitude. He was physically present, but he was not fully present. He was he was focused upon the power of getting to the parking lot without being fully present in his environment. And because he neglected the presence, the power suddenly fell away and wasn't there. And for a moment it was a little frightening, but then he recovered. When he came back to being fully present in the moment and being calmly present within that moment, then his body was able to adjust, and he simply waited for it to catch up, and it did, and everything worked out fine. For the person who seeks power, though, they might go to Red Rocks Amphitheater and say, oh, look at those people jogging up and down the whole long steps of the amphitheater. And there are people who do that every day. But they have been doing it every day. The person who comes out there and the first day wants to say, I want that power. And they immediately start jogging all the way down and jogging all the way back up. My guess is if it's their first day, they're going to collapse before they make it all the way back up, because it's quite an arduous task. It's quite strenuous. Seeking the power takes us out of ourselves. Seeking the presence puts us in ourselves, allows us to focus on our resources, but to focus on those resources in a way that connects us with our environment, that creates relationship. In a similar sort of way, people often want to focus on, let's imagine for a moment that there is an annual event that happens in your city, and for every major event, of course, there are costs and expenses. There are rental fees, or if it's held in a city park, there are park fees. There are insurance fees in case anybody gets injured during the event, all sorts of different things. It would be very easy to become focused on the money and worry about all the dollar signs and having money for all these different things, to the where you begin to exclude things that don't support the money, instead of realizing that the money was intended to support the event. Instead of worrying about the presence of the event, they worry about the power of the event. And by worrying about the power of the event, they essentially begin to rob the event of its full presence, so that it's present as a happening, but it's, to use a perhaps extreme example, it was like Dr. Frankenstein trying to create a living person and essentially creating the Frankenstein monster. He could assemble all the pieces, and it was his hope at that point that if he subjected this creature to lightning, that it would be alive. According to the book, he succeeded. But succeeded is a very tentative, dubious kind of word in that story, because the way he succeeded, he found the power, but he never accomplished the holistic presence. He never accomplished the holistic presence of life, that there is a wholeness and a holiness and a relationalness to being fully present that the power couldn't provide. If going back to our example of some sort of major annual event in a city park in whatever city across the country, you can focus on the power of it, the advertising, the money, the glitz and glamour, the best performances on stage, and so forth. If you neglect the fullness of the presence, the soul of the event, the reason why the event is there, you wind up with an animated cadaver, with a corpse that is being manipulated like a puppet, but doesn't have any substance. You can put nice makeup on it, you can make it pretty, you can make it smile, you can't make it real, because that only comes from being fully present. In the better sense of the word, by being fully present and by giving some people something in which to believe, it generally follows, the power follows the presence rather than preceding it. When I am fully present, I bring with me all the resources and abilities of the strength of my body, everything that I have. And when I fully believe in being fully present, all of those resources become the resources of the event. And if there is someone who doesn't have as much resource in one area, maybe they have more resource in another area. And maybe just the fact that they're there and can smile and cheer gives me a reason for contributing my power all the more to this event. A reason for me to be fully present. There was actually one, should I be embarrassed to confess this? I was in a theatrical production for a small town community theater at one point. And it's the only time in my life where, because it was a small town out in the middle of nowhere, I suppose. Not really out in the middle of nowhere, though, but we were doing what I thought was a very powerful play, but it was a more intellectual kind of play. It had some marvelous depth to it from the perspective of an actor, but it wasn't a sensational, happy, sing-along kind of lighthearted play. It was a deeper play, a meaningful play. Well, we put together, the director and the cast and the technical crew people put together a marvelous show. And we scheduled it and advertised it for about 6 different nights of performance, three days on one week and 3 days on the next week. Well, the second day of the second week, the 5th performance, I think it was, we arrived and we, granted it was community theater, it was being performed in an old schoolhouse. We arrived, we got all the lights, we got all the makeup, we were ready to go on, and there was no one in the audience. No one. So we kind of looked at each other and said, well, what's the point? We all went home. And in that same way, there are times when simply the encouragement of our presence may give someone the why that they need to do their best in whatever way they can do it. If there had been 2 people in the audience, we would have done the performance that night. But there wasn't even a single person to sit in the audience. It was, the only ones there were the producer and the cast and crew. And so that's an example of how presence has power. But if you seek the power and neglect the presence, well, that's essentially what happened that night. We sought the power, we had the power, but we didn't have the presence. And so the show didn't happen. In a similar sort of way, we can create an effective fundraising and financial system. We can create the most efficient bank that the world has ever seen. If there isn't something with wisdom and love to which to apply all of that, if there aren't people who will show up with their dreams and with their hopes and with their relationships, then all this power is for naught. The money can't buy the solutions that only presence can provide. To use perhaps a somewhat obvious historical example, the Titanic, the huge ocean ship, crossing the ocean, and it had been advertised and presented as if it was unsinkable and the epitome, the greatest ship ever built, and so forth. And of course it ran into an iceberg in the middle of the North Atlantic, and there was no one else around. There were a lot of very, very wealthy people on the boat, but in that moment their money was positively worthless. And the power that existed only in money did not give them the presence they needed to survive the incident. It wasn't about power at that point. It was about presence, and it was about relationship. And it was about everybody working together. And to the extent that people did not work together, and that they did not remember that sometimes the greatest resource we have is each other. In every disaster that happens throughout time, every tornado, earthquake, flood, whatever it is, a house burning down, a neighborhood burning down from a wildfire, it seems that for about a week or two, people remember that we are the best resource we have, and that the money doesn't matter if there's, if you're in the middle of the Atlantic, there's nothing to buy. You can't say, here, I've got the money for a new lifeboat. How quickly can you get it here? Next week? Oh, sorry, that's not going to last that long. The ship would be sunk way before then. The power we have in each other, however, quite often can make all the difference. To borrow a perhaps peculiar example from the insect world, I have heard stories of times where large colonies of ants wanted to cross streams or waterways, and they would basically form a chain, each one holding on to the next until they had formed a bridge literally across the entire waterway. And in those cases, I'm told that those ants very often sacrificed their lives, and they drowned. But because they drown in a certain position and they're holding on, it remains a rigid enough bridge for the other ants to cross. A story that came across through email once after a forest fire, it's probably been circulated a dozen times over, but and I'm not even sure where the location was, but apparently there had been a forest fire, and as the rangers are examining the burned off ground afterwards, they found essentially a quail that had been totally turned to ash, bit by bit, baked alive on the ground. And as they poked at it, the ash of the wings crumbled, and they discovered that it was a mother quail that had shielded her chicks from the heat of the fire. And underneath the quail's wings were however many live quail chicks. Her children had survived, and she had sacrificed her life in the fire to save them, but they had survived. Her presence is what made the power that withstood the power of the fire. It wasn't by pursuing power that life was preserved, but by being fully present. In a similar sort of way, if we look to money to be our power, instead of simply being a tool that serves our presence, we will wind up destroying ourselves. We'll pursue the power of being on the unsinkable ship, supposedly, and human arrogance will be our undoing. All that power couldn't stop the iceberg from sinking the ship. All of that power couldn't warm the North Atlantic so that people didn't freeze to death within minutes of hitting the water. It was so cold, and a hypothermia took over 1,000 lives that night, if I remember correctly. The added complication for the Titanic was that there were actually many different economic levels on the ship. There were poor people, there were middle-class people, and there were wealthy people. And they forgot each other, and they forgot their relationships, and they forgot how much ingenuity they had if they would have worked together and addressed the situation promptly. Could they have saved everyone? I don't know. I don't know that we'll ever know. My strong suspicion, however, is if from the very first moment the problem was detected, it was made known, and everyone put their heads together instead of worrying about who was wealthy and who wasn't. My suspicion is that could have created a sufficiently large raft of some sort that the casualties from the sinking of the Titanic would have been far less than they were. Far less. But in that moment, distinctions of monetary wealth essentially divided the population of the ship in ways that resulted in their demise. Instead of being present together, they reached for power, and there wasn't enough power available. It simply wasn't there. Not the power that they sought. Power that they had, they didn't use, because the power that they had was the power of their presence together. If they had, in wisdom and love, turned to each other and been present together, that would have made all the difference in the way our history books are written. Power and presence. Do we seek power or do we seek presence? When we seek presence, I believe we'll find power. If we seek power, I believe we'll do it at the expense of presence. So I invite you to learn all of the idiosyncrasies and details and hidden treasures of your presence, because the fact that you are alive and watching this show means that you do have power. You don't need to seek it. But there may be many aspects of your presence that the world desperately needs, that the divine would have you share, that are still waiting for a chance.